Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're getting into something that's, well, it's an emotional territory that I think is maybe the most universally felt, but also the most quietly endured.
It really is. We're talking about that invisible distance, that gap that can grow between you and the people who, for all intents and purposes, love you the most, your family.
It's such a painful paradox, isn't it? And for this deep dive, we've pulled together a really fascinating stack of sources. We're blending contemporary psychology with some really deep insights from existential thinkers.
Yeah, people like Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, and then we're also bringing in the very practical wisdom of Stoicism to see how it all fits together.
And they all seem to circle around this one single powerful image that I think just captures the whole conflict perfectly.
I know the one you mean. It's that feeling of sitting just outside a closed door. You want to go in, you want to express this deep festering pain you're carrying around, but you just can't.
You swallow the words. You just swallow them whole because you can almost hear it before it happens. No one on the other side of that door will truly understand.
That moment, that self-censorship, it's paralyzing. Because you're anticipating the reaction. You're bracing for you're overreacting, or the comparison, or just the blank stare.
And the sources we're looking at point out that this specific kind of pain, family pain, it's unique, it's not loud, it doesn't, scream at you like a betrayal from a friend might, or some big external tragedy.
That's right. The way they describe it is it's soft, it's deep, and it silently erodes your inner layers. It's not a sudden explosion, it's a slow, quiet breakdown. An erosion that happens paradoxically in close proximity to the people you love.
The distance isn't physical, that's the crazy part. You could be sharing a meal, sitting on the exact same couch watching TV.
But you're living in two completely different emotional realities. It's like you're operating on two different frequencies, two rhythms of life that they never quite sync up.
And that inability to sync up, that failure to touch, that's where the existential philosophy becomes so relevant. I'm thinking of Camus.
He talked about how the deepest loneliness isn't actually from being alone. It's from standing right next to the person you love and still being unable to connect, unable to really, truly reach them.
Just picture that. You're at the dinner table, everyone's physically there, you're together. But the silence, the weight of everything you're not saying is just so much heavier than any argument you could ever have.
That is the perfect description. It's like you're right next to your life raft, but you still feel like you're drowning because the one thing you need understanding isn't there.
So that's our mission for today's deep dive. We're going to try and unpack this specific, very sharp pain. Why does it hurt so damn much when the people who sacrificed everything for our survival fail to see our emotional reality?
And maybe more importantly, how can we even begin to heal what the sources are calling a profound existential betrayal?
Exactly. So we're going deep into this invisible gap. And I think the best place to start is with this idea of a clash of anxieties.
Yes, we have to start there. And the first thing to do is set aside the easy assumption that this is, a failure of love. It's not.
It's not about a lack of love.
Not at all. The love is present. It's almost always there.
Yeah.
The issue is it's almost mechanical. It's a collision of two languages, both of them rooted in anxiety, but anxiety that's expressed in completely incompatible ways.
Okay, so that reframing is crucial. This isn't malicious. It's two legitimate, powerful fears just slamming right into each other. So let's break down the parents' fear first. What's the root of their protective drive?
Well, their motivation is almost always rooted in survival and this deep protective fear. They are terrified that their child you will suffer, that you'll fail, that you'll get lost, or that you just won't be able to survive let's be honest, the relentless complexity of this new era.
And so they feel like they have to use every tool they've ever learned to stop that from happening.
Every single one. And their toolkit, as the sources really lay out clearly, is intensely focused on things they can see and measure, tangible external metrics.
So their anxiety gets expressed through what? Commanding, judging.
Exactly that. Commanding, judging, warning, comparing, imposing these really rigid standards. Because you have to remember, for them, these were the most effective survival tools they had to navigate their world, to ensure you had food on the table.
When they worry, they deploy control.
Yes, and that control looks like comparison. Why can't you be more like your cousin? He has a stable job, or it's a command. You must study engineering, it's safe. Or just constant warnings. If you don't do X, you will end up with nothing.
But it's their clumsy, flawed attempt at showing love through guidance and certainty.
It's the only way they know how. Meanwhile, you've got the younger generation trying to communicate its own anxiety using a completely different vocabulary.
We're not talking about job security in the same way. We're talking about individual values, mental health, emotional honesty.
Personal freedom, finding an authentic path. Our metrics are internal, they're psychological.
So you end up in this completely frustrating circular conversation. One side is trying to show love by enforcing a rigid structure.
And the other side is trying to feel secure by demanding emotional space and validation for their feelings.
So both sides are basically screaming, I'm scared.
Exactly. They're both speaking a language of anxiety, but it's like one is speaking Mandarin and the other is speaking Portuguese. They're hearing words, but the meaning, the interpretation is just worlds apart.
Which makes the conflict basically inevitable. It's a language failure, not a moral failure on either side.
Precisely. And the central injustice that one of the psychological sources highlights is just so powerful. It's that parents are judging the profound psychological pain of the 21st century.
Using the completely outdated standards of the 20th century.
They just cannot calibrate the difficulty level of modern life. And to get this, we really have to look at the specific differences in what hardship even means.
For our parents' generation, hardship was.
Mm-hmm.
It was visible. It was material.
Right. Lack of food, post-war reconstruction, real poverty, physical instability. If you had a roof over your head and you weren't starving, you were considered a success. It was all about physical, materials, survival.
And that required a certain set of skills. Grit, endurance, sacrifice. And you know what? Those tools worked perfectly for that reality.
They did. But what about the hardship facing a young person today?
It's almost entirely invisible.
Overwhelmingly psychological, systemic. We're talking about chronic mental pressure.
Yeah.
The invisible competition of a globalized world where you're up against everyone, everywhere, all the time.
The staggering speed of social change, and this profound, often paralyzing lack of a clear direction, a clear path.
Our crisis isn't typically about physical starvation. It's a spiritual and emotional starvation. It's the struggle to find meaning and authenticity in a world that feels like it demands constant, shallow performance.
So if the parent's mission is survive physically, and the child's mission is survive psychologically without breaking,
they will never, ever agree on what success looks like. It's impossible.
and the parents look at the comfortable home, the access to education, the full fridge, and they just conclude.
My child is fine. They have it so much easier than I did. They live a lighter life.
And they completely fail to recognize the immense invisible burdens we're carrying. The fear of existential emptiness, the pressure of a digital identity, the chronic stress of financial precarity, even when you have a degree.
Their worldview it lacks the category for these new threats. They don't have a box to put burnout in, so they just label it laziness. They mistake the difference in our suffering for a weakness in us, the sufferer.
They can't see the threat because it has no shape. It has no sound, no smell like their old fears did.
Exactly. They had to run from a war. We have to run from burnout. And to them, those two things are just not equivalent. They can't be.
Which is the gap. That's the gap we need to understand. They think because they endured hunger, we should be able to just get over something like generalized anxiety.
They lack the lived experience, and this is the key, the emotional vocabulary to see these new forms of suffering as legitimate threats to our survival. And that lack of recognition, sadly, feels like the ultimate invalidation.
This is a perfect bridge to part 2, because to really get this gap, we have to bring the context to life. It's not just a difference of a few decades. It's the sheer exponential speed of change.
Yes, the sources really emphasize this point. If you were born around the year 2000, your entire foundational reality, the operating system of your life, runs on rules that were completely alien when your parents were building their mental maps for what success and stability looked like.
I love the analogy the sources use for this. They contrast the parents' railway reality with the younger generation's maze reality. Let's start with the railway. What did that look like?
The railway reality was, above all, predictable. It was linear. You bought a ticket for a specific destination, and the tracks only went one way.
So you study a proven field, you graduate, you get a job at a stable company.
You stay at that one job for 30, 40 years. You start a family, you build stability, you pay off the house, and then you retire. Hard work was the locomotive.
It was hard, for sure, often unfair, but your effort generally correlated directly with a decent outcome. There was a sense of, if I do these things, I will be okay.
There was a clear cause and effect. That world offered a certain kind of stability and certainty. You knew the rules of the game. Now, contrast that with the maze.
It's a maze reality, the chaotic world we're in now.
The maze is defined by one word: instability. Think about career paths. The skills you spent 4 years and $100,000 learning in university can be made obsolete by a new AI model in, 2 years?
Or less. And that stable company your parents worked for might downsize its entire middle management overnight to cut costs. Path A just vanishes. Path B requires you to become a global freelancer with your own brand.
And Path C is completely automated. There is no straight line. There are only multiple, constantly shifting routes, and most of them are dead ends.
And the terrifying part of that, as the sources point out, is the exhaustion, the constant, unending demand to adapt, to network, to learn new skills, to market yourself. It leads to this profound exhaustion, even if you feel like you're standing still.
You are constantly running at full speed just to maintain your place in the race. You're not even trying to get ahead, you're just trying not to fall behind.
Which feeds directly into this massive shift in what we're afraid of. For the parent generation, as we said, fear was tangible.
It had a quality you could identify: hunger, unemployment, the enemy in a war. They had a shape, a sound, a smell. You knew what you were fighting against. You knew where to direct your energy.
Our fears, on the other hand, are so often invisible, and they're pervasive. Things like meaninglessness, burnout, the chronic low-level hum of social anxiety.
The fear of being left behind by technology, the fear of failure being magnified and broadcast across every social media platform imaginable for everyone to see.
How do you even begin to explain the crushing weight of existential emptiness to someone whose primary daily fear was having enough rice to feed their family?
You really can't. They lack the emotional vocabulary because they lack the experiential context. It's not their fault. When a parent hears a phrase like, "I'm having an existential crisis," their brain translates it through their own filter.
And that filter says what?
It says, "You are not working hard enough," or "You have too much free time to think about all this nonsense." They cannot compute that you are suffering because you are working so hard and still feel completely and utterly lost.
And the role of social media in all this. We can't overstate it. The sources make a really strong case that social media has become this terrifying magnifier for the whole generational gap.
It's a great point. In the railway reality, who did your parents compare you to? A dozen, maybe 2 dozen people?
The neighbor's kid, your cousin, maybe a few kids of their coworkers at the office. It was very contained local competition.
Today's young person is being benchmarked against the entire idealized, perfectly curated world. We see the highlight reels of millions: instantaneous success, overnight wealth, idealized relationships, perfect bodies.
All in a constant 247 loop in the palm of your hand.
Yeah.
The average person is comparing their own messy, complex, invisible internal struggle to the filtered perfection of everyone else's public performance.
The psychological cost of that constant global comparison is just astronomical. It leads to this deep feeling of depletion, inadequacy, and exhaustion.
Then what happens when you pour the parental judgment, the judgment of the 20th century, on top of that already existing sense of global inadequacy?
It becomes toxic. It becomes gasoline on a fire. The sources say that young people are already pushing themselves to the absolute brink of depletion, and then the family judgment comes in and turns that depletion into despair.
Because it validates that deep, dark inner feeling that despite working harder and faster than ever, you are still somehow not good enough.
That's the core misunderstanding right there. Parents believe we live lighter lives because there's more material opportunity. They completely fail to see that we live faster, we are more competitive, we're more isolated, and we suffer far greater psychological harm as a result.
They see a difference in our approach to life, and they label it as a moral weakness or a spiritual failing, completely missing the unbelievable complexity of the environment we're trying to navigate.
And that realization that they don't see the world we see, that leads us right into part 3. We have to dive into the core psychology here. Why does parental love so often feel like defensive judgment?
Let's really try to unpack the motivation. The sources offer this deep psychological insight that I found really illuminating. It's that parents love us the way they know how, but that love is filtered. It's almost damaged by their own historical wounds and their own survival instincts.
It's love, but it's self-protection first. That is such a critical distinction, and you can see these clear patterns emerge based on their own upbringing.
Okay, so give us an example.
Well, if a parent grew up in a situation of extreme material lack, real economic scarcity, they learned that the only way to survive was through tight control.
So they express their love by trying to control their child's choices. their money, their career path.
Exactly. They believe that resources, opportunities, they must be tightly managed to guarantee safety. Control equals safety in their mind.
What if they grew up with instability, like political upheaval or a family crisis?
Then they often express love through constant, unrelenting worry. And their worry isn't really about your current situation, it's the constant echo of their past instability. Every decision you make feels like a potential cliff edge to them.
And if they experience deep trauma, or were just taught that showing emotions was dangerous?
They try to live by locking their child into the safest, most rigid mold they can imagine, the life they wish they had access to. And this comes across as total rigidity, inflexibility. There is only one right way to live.
So all of it, the judgment, the comparison, the constant stream of warnings, it's not actually a personal attack on the child's character.
Not at its root, it is an expression of their deepest, most profound anxiety. The fear of losing you or seeing you suffer in the exact same way that they suffered. It looks like control on the surface, but the root is this deep, self-preserving fear.
And judgment also serves as a self-defense mechanism for the parent.
Right, a vital one. When parents are confronted with a world they just don't recognize, a world where their child is having a crisis they can't even categorize, let alone solve, they feel utterly and completely helpless.
And helplessness is terrifying.
It's the worst feeling for a parent. So when they judge or compare or criticize, they're not really attacking your behavior. They're attacking their own feeling of helplessness. It's a desperate attempt to regain some sense of control over an uncontrollable, rapidly changing world.
That explains so much about the constant dismissal of emotional pain. That's why they say things like, you're just overreacting, or the classic, we had it 10 times worse.
It stems directly from this defense. They grew up in environments where emotional expression was a profound liability. If you showed weakness during a war or a famine, you were vulnerable. You put yourself and your family at risk.
So survival required what the sources call emotional numbness.
Exactly. They had to endure pain, suppress their feelings, and internalize the message that talking about your feelings was a weakness or an impractical luxury you couldn't afford. They literally learned to be numb to survive.
So they often truly, genuinely lack the emotional dictionary to process intense modern feelings like generalized anxiety or depression.
Absolutely. When their child comes to them expressing genuine mental distress, they often deny it, not out of cruelty, but because they genuinely lack the tools. They were conditioned to suppress their own emotional language for decades. How can they be fluent in yours?
They can't process their own buried feelings, let alone understand the nuanced, complex emotional landscape of a 21st century young person.
So they default to the only tool they have. Tough it out. That's what I did, and I'm fine.
And this is where we get to the core existential damage, the wound itself. The family is supposed to be the first and safest place where we learn who we are, and that who we are is okay. So what happens when that primary source of validation denies our authentic feelings?
It creates this sense of being fundamentally wrong, broken, odd, inadequate. You're forced to hide your true self, to perform a version of yourself that the family deems acceptable and safe.
And the sources draw this crucial distinction. This isn't just, being sad for a day.
No. It is the feeling of not being allowed to exist in your original true form. It's a rejection of your very essence.
Which brings us right back to the existentialists. I'm thinking of Sartre's idea that the judgment of the people you love can become the most subtle prison.
It's the perfect phrase for it. If the voice you trust most in the world is telling you that your reality is false, you become a prisoner of your own internal experience. You start to doubt your own sanity.
And that is the psychological betrayal. Younger generations just assume, they expect the family to be the ultimate safe refuge, the one place of unconditional listening.
And when that vulnerability is met, not with comfort, but with rejection or minimization or a harsh comparison, it's a profound psychological cut.
It's a double wound. You're hurt by the rejection itself, but the pain is amplified 1,000 times because it came from the one place you thought you were safe. It shatters that foundational trust in yourself.
And the reason this specific pain is so long-lasting, why it lingers for years, even decades, is because that critical moment of acknowledgement never arrived. That one simple statement.
You have the right to feel that way.
Or just, your concerns are real, I hear you. It was withheld.
And without that validation, the pain doesn't just fade away, it solidifies. It becomes a core identity belief.
I am wrong. I am too difficult. My needs are invalid. And the individual is left to carry that incredibly heavy burden all by themselves, constantly believing that their inherent essence is a problem that needs to be managed or hidden.
The tragedy is that you have these two sides just colliding. The parent's injury is their fear of losing control, and our injury is the fear of being judged incorrectly.
And that silence, that profound retreat from ever having a genuine conversation again. That's the subject of part 4. We have to look at the cycle of trauma transfer and the creation of this massive emotional distance.
As the younger generation starts to navigate these territories that their parents just have no map for, complex career changes, hidden depression, existential crises.
They have to, by necessity, walk alone. And this prolonged period of solitude, of self-management, is what creates the distance. It creates a void between them.
It's not a distance built from anger, is it?
No, not usually. It's a gap that's built from a lack of shared language and the slow, painful realization that sharing your truth is just too dangerous, it's too costly.
The clash of core values just accelerates this drift. The older generation, they value endurance, stability, sacrifice, and, keeping up a good outward image.
While the youth, conversely, are valuing emotional honesty, self-sovereignty, mental health, and life balance.
They're operating on two fundamentally different moral systems.
Completely. One side believes that enduring the struggle is virtuous. The other side believes that enduring the struggle for too long is actually destructive to your mental health.
So when a child says, "I'm prioritizing my mental health over this high-paying but soul-crushing job," the parent sees weakness.
While the child sees self-preservation, it's an irreconcilable difference in worldview.
And so the lesson you inevitably learn after maybe years of trying to open up and being met with, "Why are you so worried others have it so much worse?" is simple, and it's devastating.
Silence is safer, the core vulnerable parts of yourself. You just stop sharing them.
And that creates the permanent wall. It's not built of loud, aggressive arguments. The source says it's built from untriggered conversations.
I love that phrase. The wall is composed of everything you refuse to say.
Yeah.
All the moments of genuine feeling that you just swallowed whole to preserve the peace.
And the real tragedy of this whole deep dive is that these unhealed family wounds, they don't just stay neatly contained within the household.
No, they follow us. They follow us into every single external relationship we form for the rest of our lives. This is the mechanism of generational trauma transfer.
So let's break that down. How exactly does that work, according to the psychological analysis in our sources?
Okay, so the first and probably the most pervasive way it transfers is through the internalization of self-doubt. When you hear you're too sensitive or you're exaggerating enough times.
It creates a core, unshakable belief inside you.
Exactly. The belief is, I am difficult to understand. My feelings are a burden to other people.
And that core belief leads directly to emotional withdrawal in every relationship that follows. You become guarded, you become terrified of sharing vulnerability.
And you preemptively cut off your own emotional needs because you're just conditioned to expect misunderstanding or pain when you expose your true self. You're always waiting for the other person to call you complicated or too much.
Okay, what's the second way it transfers?
The inner critic takes up residence. That parental judgment doesn't just vanish when you leave home. It takes up permanent residence inside your own mind. That little voice whispering, "You're weak, you're doing it wrong." Or the crushing, "You're just not good enough."
And that critic is absolutely relentless. It affects your career performance, right? It shows up as crippling fear of making mistakes or intense imposter syndrome.
And it just destroys romantic relationships because the person feels fundamentally deep down undeserving of genuine, unconditional love. They're always waiting for the other shoe to drop, for their partner to finally see them the way their parents did and confirm their inner critic's judgment.
The third major transfer is, what? The shattering of your internal compass.
Emotional invalidation, yes. If you are constantly told that your fears or your anxieties are nonsense, you eventually stop trusting your own internal guidance system. You lose the ability to correctly identify your own emotional needs or set healthy boundaries.
And what's the real-world consequence of a broken internal compass?
Poor choices, consistently poor choices. You might choose partners who replicate the invalidation you received at home because it feels familiar. Or you pursue careers that make you miserable because you've confused external validation with internal fulfillment.
You just don't know how to choose what is genuinely good for you because your own feelings were always deemed unreliable.
And finally, there's the chronic fear of conflict. If you learn as a child that saying your truth or trying to set a boundary leads to painful, chaotic family conflict,
you develop a lifelong avoidance of any kind of argument.
You become unable to say no, you run away from problems, and you often replicate that same silence-based dysfunctional pattern in your new relationships, preferring a toxic, quiet peace to a necessary, healthy fight.
The source's observation that so many of our current relationship conflicts are just echoes of fights we had in our family home long ago it's chilling, but it also shows us exactly what needs to be healed.
That deep realization that the injury is internal and it follows you everywhere, that is the absolute prerequisite for healing. If we can't change their actions, we have to change our reaction.
Which takes us to part V. This is all about the practical, philosophy-backed strategies the sources offer to protect ourselves and strategically manage this impossible-seeming relationship.
If the conflict is about trying to control what we cannot control, which is their reactions, then the sources guide us towards Stoicism, the ancient practice of emotional separation.
And Stoicism doesn't ask us to just ignore the pain, right?
Not at all. It asks us to radically differentiate between what is within our control, our response, our understanding, and what is completely outside of it, their love, their fear-driven judgment.
So the first step is to separate the essence from the reaction. When they judge or compare or try to enforce their expectations, we need to look past the surface level, past the aggression, to what's underneath.
So if they say, you should choose this major, not that one, the surface is control. But the essence is, they are terrified for your economic survival, they lack the language to trust your world, and they're afraid of the unknown.
We have to replace the interpretation, they think I'm an idiot or they don't respect me,
with the more neutral, more empathetic interpretation. They are afraid, and they lack the proper tools to express that fear.
And its sources make this really fascinating, quantifiable claim about this mental shift.
They do. They estimate that by seeing the underlying fear instead of just the surface reaction, the amount of pain we absorb is reduced significantly, by up to 40%.
Wow, that's emotional disarmament. You neutralize the insult by understanding the motive.
And this leads, crucially, to strategic communication. The sources strongly advise against sharing your raw, abstract, deep emotions with parents who just lack the capacity or the vocabulary for them.
So telling your parents about your existential dread or your feeling of profound meaninglessness
is only going to trigger their alarm system. It'll send them straight back into fixing mode, or even worse, denial mode.
So the strategy is translation. We have to translate our complex psychological reality into concrete context that they can actually process.
Exactly. So instead of saying, I'm stressed, my work feels meaningless, I'm completely burned out, the sources suggest saying something like, the speed of my work lately has been intense. I'm learning some new adaptation techniques, and I'm making sure to allocate more time to sleep to manage the workload.
You translate the internal abstract crisis into a manageable external problem that they can fit into their worldview.
And this requires setting a conversation objective very clearly. Parents instinctively default to fixing mode. It's what they think their role is, to solve problems and provide certainty.
So before you share anything sensitive, you have to preemptively guide them.
You have to say, Mom, Dad, I need 5 minutes. I want to share my feelings about my job, but I just need you to listen. I don't need any advice or a solution right now. You're gently directing them into listening mode and lowering their defensive need to seize control of the conversation.
There's also the vital, but so often overlooked practical element, choosing the right time. The airplane landing analogy.
Yes. We cannot blame our parents for reacting poorly if we choose the absolute worst possible moment to open up, like when they're stressed or angry about their own day or exhausted after a long day at work.
Emotional conversations require calm skies.
If you try to open up a major vulnerability while they're distracted or emotionally depleted themselves, you are just setting yourself up for failure. This technique emphasizes that you have to manage the environment of the conversation, which is something firmly within your control.
And then there's the language of autonomy. The sources advise us to stop the pattern of talking to our parents from the timid, over-apologetic, and overly explanatory voice of a child.
Because that voice, that tone, signals to them that you are still dependent and that they must step in to correct you.
Instead, you need to speak clearly, calmly, and neutrally, without justifying yourself or challenging their entire worldview.
A calm, certain tone signals maturity and self-sovereignty. It communicates, I am sharing this with you as an update, I am not asking for your approval. A weak or overly apologetic tone just signals to them that they need to intervene and take back the reins of your life.
Okay, but what about when they deploy harsh language? We need a defense mechanism, the neutral feedback technique. So when they say something like, you're just being weak, or stop thinking all this nonsense and get a real job, how do we respond without getting into an emotional fight?
You avoid absorbing the weight of their judgment, and you refuse to engage in the conflict. You use neutral feedback instead of emotional confrontation. You respond with statements that reflect their anxiety, not your defense.
So something like, I understand that you're worried for me.
Or, I hear your concern, and I will take that into consideration. You acknowledge their emotional state without validating their statement about your character. This refuses to absorb their emotional weight, and it prevents the whole thing from escalating into a huge fight.
The sources also empower us with the right to silence, which is huge. Not every judgment needs an answer or a defense.
Silence, in this context, is not surrender. It is the fundamental right to refuse to participate in someone else's fear or outdated worldview. This whole section is really a blueprint for changing the interaction, even if you can't change the parent themselves.
Which brings us to part 6, where the focus has to shift entirely inward. The deepest, most powerful healing has to be self-directed. It's about accepting the limits of what this parental relationship can ever provide.
This is what the sources call the cold but mature realization. Your parents may never ever change to the extent that you wish they would, or that you need them to.
We have to accept their limitations.
We have to. They are constrained by decades of rigid survival instincts, old world models, and a lifetime of emotional repression. They aren't villains, they're just humans with immense historical limits.
And when we can see them as humans with limits, and not just as the idealized parent or the evil villain, we can stop internalizing their lack of emotional tools as a verdict on our own worth.
We can finally recognize that their incapacity to validate our pain is a reflection of their own historical wounds, not a statement about the validity of our current experience.
And then we can finally deploy Stoicism's greatest tool, the power of separation. We have to actively separate the external event, the parental criticism, from the meaning that we attach to it.
So their statement, "you worry about nothing," is the external event.
But our interpretation, where the pain comes from, is the meaning we attach to it. I am weak, or they dismiss my pain, therefore my pain must be fake.
And healing requires changing that interpretation to, they lack the language for my problem, so I refuse to accept their interpretation of my reality. We reclaim ownership of our pain and our value.
Crucial to this self-healing process is consciously returning what isn't ours to carry. The sources list these heavy weights we carry around. Their expectations, their unfulfilled dreams, their fears, the shame they imposed on the family.
We owe them gratitude. Gratitude for the sacrifices they made for our physical survival, but we absolutely do not owe them our life path, our identity, or our happiness.
Healing demands identifying these external weights and consciously letting them go, setting down the baggage that was never ours to carry in the first place.
And the sources also strongly emphasize the necessity of building what they call a second family, an external ecosystem of support.
So if your family of origin, the root, is too unstable or judgmental, you need the treetop.
Yes, the treetop of friends, mentors, a good therapist, supportive communities, any group that can offer non-judgmental understanding.
This external support network is essential for grounding yourself. It provides the crucial validation and emotional mirroring that your family of origin failed to provide.
And it gives you the stability you need to navigate life without constantly seeking approval from a source that is never, ever going to give it.
And the highest form of healing, according to this analysis, is breaking the cycle. The ultimate goal isn't just personal relief, but ensuring that we do not repeat this cycle of trauma transmission with our own children or our partners.
Which means being proactive. We have to identify the dysfunctional schemas we absorbed. For instance, realizing that the schema of lack of emotional validation leads us to unconsciously choose partners who also invalidate us. By seeing the pattern, we can finally interrupt it.
So the new mission then becomes learning to love other people in the exact way we wish we had been loved.
It means listening more deeply, consistently validating the feelings of others, and most importantly, never using fear or control as a way to guide love. We become kind and understanding because we know, intimately, the deep, silent pain of being invalidated and misunderstood.
Fine, we have to redefine freedom. True freedom isn't about running away or cutting all ties, though sometimes, of course, that is necessary.
True freedom, in this context, is the ability to maintain your core sense of self and your inherent value, regardless of how your parents react or judge or project their anxiety onto you. Their voice and their opinions should no longer be allowed to define your essential worth.
And this leads to the new, healthier relationship model. The relationship only becomes functional when we finally stop seeking validation from them.
Instead, we assume the role of an autonomous adult who knows their own direction and calmly communicates from that position of certainty. This shifts the entire dynamic. You move from being a child seeking approval to an adult offering shared context, which is so much less emotionally charged.
And that, at the end of the day, is the essence of this whole humanistic tragedy. The distance is not a failure of love.
It is a failure of language, of context, and the inability of two generations to operate using two radically incompatible maps of the world. The love is there, but the communication tools are just completely shattered.
This has been a really profound exploration, moving from that silent pain of betrayal all the way through to actionable, philosophical self-sovereignty. Let's quickly summarize the central themes for everyone listening.
I think the central theme is this paradoxical pain. The love is present, but the language and the context are fundamentally misaligned. The parent's fierce desire to protect you translates into judgment and control because their world maps just lack the emotional vocabulary for our modern psychological struggles.
And our pain stems from that sense of existential betrayal, when our primary source of love refuses to validate our essential reality.
And we highlighted the practical strategies for the younger generation, drawn from Stoicism and behavioral psychology, the necessity of setting clear boundaries, the technique of communicating concrete context over raw, abstract emotion, using the neutral feedback technique to avoid escalation.
And deploying that stoic separation to protect your internal space from their fear-driven projections.
And we stress that true healing is a slow, self-directed process. It's about living forward with a new understanding, not trying to erase the past. It's about consciously choosing a life that is not defined by the internalized trauma and the dysfunctional schemas you absorbed growing up.
You choose to define yourself.
And this leads us to the really powerful final reflection offered by the source material. It suggests that if a bridge is ever going to be built between these two separated generations, if the river of communication is ever going to flow again, it has to be constructed from the side of the person who understands the terrain better.
And that person, having gone through this process of self-reflection, of emotional education, of understanding the massive scale of generational context,
is often you, the younger generation. You possess the intellectual and emotional map that your parents simply lack.
So the provocative thought we want to leave you with is this: what unique responsibility does this greater understanding place on you as the potential builder of that bridge? And how will you choose to honor both your necessary, non-negotiable emotional truth and their enduring yet very limiting human fears and constraints?